And we are on the second day of early voting. If you don't know, now you know. Now is your chance to make your voice heard for the May 19th primary as well as election day, because it is an election day for a couple of positions. And we have two candidates running for Georgia Supreme Court. The first one we're going to be speaking with is Jen Jordan, joining us in the studio this morning. Good morning, Ms. Jordan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we truly appreciate you coming in. We know that you've been running a very tough campaign. You've been campaigning with Ms. Miracle Rankin, who we will be speaking with momentarily. But first, we're speaking with you. And I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
That I wanted to ask you as the voters are weighing their options. We know that you are challenging incumbent Justice Sarah Hawkins Warren. I want to talk to you about your political career, because we know that you were a former state senator. You were serving as a Democrat. You were advocating for voting rights, reproductive access, but now you are running for a nonpartisan role, asking voters to separate what you have campaigned for and voted for in the past to what you are going to do as potentially as a Supreme Court justice, or excuse me, Georgia Supreme Court justice here. What specific decisions from your time in the Senate can you point to where you ruled against your party's interest, and how does that prove you can separate ideology from the law of the bench?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that what it comes down to is, look, when I won in 2017, I flipped a Republican district that Hunter Hill represented. He wasn't, I don't even think people think Senator Hill was a moderate, and went into the state Senate. I really represented one of the only competitive state Senate seats, because everything's so gerrymandered now that it's either like a far right or far left. And so for me, I represented a district that was literally 50-50, right? And so going into the state Senate and representing just as many Republicans as I represented Democrats, independents, everybody in between, the most important thing was really fighting for their interest and really listening to them in terms of what their needs are. And one of the things that I did that, you know, it was more of a party line vote for a lot of other people, but for property tax decreases. And so I like to say that I actually brought more tax relief to my Senate district than Hunter Hill ever did. And so that's what I like people to look at. It's not necessarily the D or the R, it's serving the people that voted for you, and even if they didn't vote for you, right? Because you are still their representative and they still need you there fighting for them.
Thank you so much. And I should ask too, for those who are not familiar with your name, maybe some viewers this could be their first impression of you. Why are you running for Supreme Court of Georgia?
You know, I'm running, look, I've been an attorney for about 25 years, representing people when they needed it most. A lot of times dealing with consumer cases. You know, I spent many years trying to fight payday lending outfits that were taking advantage of folks. And I always like to say that my law practice really was kind of David versus Goliath, right? It's always the powerful that are taking advantage of the little person. And so that's how I've spent the last 25 years. And look, I think that in terms of how the court is currently constructed, I don't even know what the word would be, but in terms of the opinions that are coming out of the court, really it does seem that maybe the powerful have their thumb, you know, on the scale, and we've kind of lost. We've really lost the priority, which should be always the people of this state, the individuals.
Thank you so much for your answer. I want to ask you about some of the support around your campaign. We know that groups like Planned Parenthood Votes are investing heavily in this race on your behalf. And if a case involving abortion restrictions reaches the court, why shouldn't voters see your prior advocacy and financial backing as a conflict? And under what circumstances, if any, would you recuse yourself?
So let's say in terms of the Planned Parenthood, that is something called an independent expenditure. I know nothing about it. I actually saw it for the first time just like anybody else did. And with respect to the contributions to my campaign, though, those are all disclosed. And anybody can look at those and see for themselves in terms of who's supporting me and where the money's coming from. In terms of ruling a particular way, this is what's hard, because the judicial canons say you can't talk about anything that is a live case that may come before the Supreme Court, right? Because you don't want to have to recuse. So that's what makes this a little difficult, right? Because people do care about the values that a candidate has and where that candidate comes from. What's that candidate's experience, right? Do you trust this person to make the best decisions for you and your family? And that really comes from our backgrounds, right? I'm originally from South Georgia. I grew up with a single mom. You know, I paid my way and worked my way through college and law school. And I absolutely love being a lawyer. All of that is important, right? But what's also important are, like, what are my values? Like, what do I personally believe? And let's be clear, you can have a personal belief, and you may have to rule differently on the bench if the law and the Constitution requires it, right? That's just the way it is. But it's one of those things where I think people want to know, where are you coming from, and what are your values and beliefs? And, you know.
What are your values and beliefs?
So I believe that women should have personal autonomy. That's my personal belief, right? I believe that my daughter should have the same rights that I did for the last 50 years, right? That's what I believe. And I want my daughter to go to college here. I want my daughter to have my grandchildren here and stay here and work here. And right now, all she is talking about is leaving the state of Georgia. And that is crushing, right? This is a great state, and there are great people here. And it's one of those things where when you put yourself up for public service, you really are about serving the public and the people.
Thank you so much for your answer. I want to ask you about something that you've said. You've publicly described the Georgia Supreme Court as the last line of defense for reproductive rights. And I know that you just said that you don't want to weigh on a potential future case, but the language, and even when you talk about your personal beliefs, it could sound to some people as advocacy instead of judicial restraint. If you are confirmed, how do you reconcile statements like that with the exception that justices interpret law and not defend specific outcomes?
So, look, I think what I'll lean into, because I can't talk about Georgia in terms of the decisions or the law, right? That's kind of, we got to put that aside right now that I'm a judicial candidate. But what I can tell you is that I think that Dobbs was wrongly decided, the U.S. Supreme Court case. And when I talk about the Georgia court being the last line of defense, in terms of any rights, let's talk about fundamental rights, period. What we have seen at the U.S. Supreme Court level, this current iteration of the court is the most regressive court in the history of the Supreme Court. What do I mean by regressive? I mean they have ruled more times to take away people's rights, to take away civil rights, to rule against individuals, more than any other court in the history of our country, right? And we're 250 years old. So in 250 years, this is the most regressive court. But one of the things that court has done is they have said, you know what, you're not going to get any protection here under the federal Constitution. We're gonna basically just throw, decades and decades of precedent out the window. You're not going to get any protection here. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go to your state courts, and you're going to have to seek justice, remedy, whatever you want to call it, under state law or the state constitution. So now that the door is closed on the federal courts for us, right? The last line of defense in terms of any of these rights that people might feel very strongly about and care about, if there is an issue around those rights, you are going to have to bring it to the Georgia Supreme Court. So it's not an advocacy thing, as more it is a statement of fact. And we know that because these issues are percolating right now in the appellate court system.
Thank you so much for your answer. I want to ask you something about something that happened a couple of years back. You were subpoenaed in the 2020 election interference investigation against President Donald Trump. We know that that case was dismissed, but your involvement, it places you inside this highly political legal battle. Now, if a related election case comes before the court, can you commit now to a clear recusal standard? Where do you draw that line?
Yeah, I was a witness, right? I was a witness before the grand jury. I was subpoenaed to be a witness at trial before, the Supreme Court upheld the Court of Appeals decision to basically end the prosecution. And so as a witness, it doesn't matter if it's a political case or a high-profile case, or if I was a witness to a car wreck, right? Then that case works its way up. If I'm a witness, I have to recuse. Right? So anything dealing with the 2020 election or allegations of election interference in terms of 2020, absolutely, it would have to be a clear recusal, and I don't think there's any question about that.
Can I ask you, why should voters choose your name instead of your incumbent on that ballot?
Well, you know what? I have spent my entire life really working for individuals and people in this state. And whether I was somebody's individual attorney or I represented you when I was in the state Senate, I've always had broad support across the board. I like to say Democrats, Republicans, in between, independents, people who hate both parties, doesn't want to be associated with any of the partisan stuff. What they know is that when I have been in positions where I needed to work for them or serve them, that I have worked as hard as I could to make sure that their best interest was always put first. And that it didn't matter who they were, where they come from, who their daddy knows, whatever it is, that I'm always going to be the person looking out for them and thinking about them in terms of any kind of decision making that I make on the Supreme Court.
Is that your message to voters as they head to, we're in the early voting period now, and we know, for those who don't know, there is no primary here. The decision that is made for your race, at least.
Absolutely. Like May 19th is it, right?
Yeah.
As my 17-year-old daughter is like, thank goodness, right? She does not love the political parts of this, right? But here, we're just trying to tell everybody, and we're talking to everybody, right? And I'm going all over this state because, look, I have lived all over this state. I am from South Georgia. I know these people. I care about these people, right? I've represented Buckhead, West Paces Ferry. The governor's mansion was in my district. Sometimes they didn't like that. All the things, right? But I will tell you that I have always delivered for the people who have ever put me in those positions, and even I've delivered for those who didn't vote for me. And that's what everybody needs to understand, is that even if you don't vote for me, I will still work for you every day.
All right, Ms. Jordan, thank you so much
Thank
for
you
coming
so
on
much.
and speaking with us once again. For those who are watching, Jen Jordan, candidate for Georgia Supreme Court.